Hey, welcome back to Critical Thinking. We are pressing ever forward in our study of informal fallacies, and I know it seems like we've been doing this forever. I think I told you in the beginning there are hundreds of informal fallacies, and believe it or not, we are not covering all of them. It seems like we are sometimes, but we are not covering all of them. We're only scratching the surface, and we're covering the ones that I think are the most common, as well as a few additional ones. I'm trying to be as thorough as I can, but I don't want to overwhelm you, and hopefully you don't feel that way at this point. But we're going to pick up where we left off last time with our informal fallacies of presumption, and let's go ahead and dive right in. So far we've studied fallacies of ambiguity and relevance, and lately we have been focusing on the fallacies of presumption. This time we're going to be moving on and focusing specifically on fallacies of presumption in inductive reasoning, specifically with the subcategories of generalization and reduction. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the fallacies that we're going to be focusing on in this session. We're actually going to look at three fallacies in a subcategory that we're going to call generalization. After that, we're going to move on to three fallacies in a subcategory called reduction. And as always, before I get into the specific fallacies, I want to spend some time looking at what we mean by fallacies of presumption in inductive reasoning in general, and then look at the subcategory before going on to the particular fallacies. So let's take a look at what we mean by fallacies of presumption in inductive reasoning. And as I mentioned several videos ago, there are regular fallacies of presumption and there are fallacies of presumption that are specifically concerned with faulty assumptions in scientific or inductive reasoning. Induction, remember, is the process of observing evidence to derive a probable conclusion or explanation. For example, we observe that objects tend to fall to the ground, so we posit something like the law of gravity. Inductive fallacies occur when the evidence to support an argument is either incomplete, it's being distorted, misused, or even misinterpreted. Some philosophers believe that induction is absolutely always fallacious. And we'll cover induction in another video on scientific thinking, specifically fallacies in identifying causal relations. And we'll take up the so-called problem of induction when we touch on philosophy of science down the road a little bit. For now, let's look at the subcategory of generalization. This is our first one, and that is the process of deriving a characteristic from repeated experience of similar particular instances of objects, and asserting that characteristic universally across a target class. If I was going to illustrate it, we might pick out something like a characteristic of being covered with fur from repeated experience of individual cats. Come across a cat, we notice that it's covered in fur. And then we conclude, after enough experiences, that fur coveredness, let's say, is a characteristic of the entire class we call cat. In other words, we'll say that all cats have fur. That's a generalization from the particular. The first fallacy in this category is called the Dictosimplicator. It's an example of what we might call the general rule fallacy. It's sometimes also called a sweeping generalization or destroying the exception. And this fallacy occurs specifically when the general rule cited is false, or when the general rule is reliable, but it doesn't apply in this specific case. The full Latin phrase from which the name actually comes is ad dicto simplicator ad dictum secundum quid, which means from the statement unqualified to the statement qualified, indicating that the problem arises when we cite the general rule without acknowledging qualifying factors, exceptions, and things like that. One mistakenly assumes that what's true in general under normal circumstances must be true in every particular case under special circumstances. An argument overextends a generalization when it includes cases that ought to be excluded. Just because something is generally true, it doesn't mean that it is always true. Now, the Dictosimplicator is also often called the fallacy of accident. And an accident, it's a philosophical term that refers to an attribute that a member of a class may have, but the possession of which is not necessitated by the nature of the thing. In other words, it's not an essential characteristic. So to illustrate this, we could talk about an accidental characteristic such as hair color in humans. A person may have brown hair, but just because that person has brown hair doesn't mean that all people have to have brown hair or must have brown hair. Okay? An essential characteristic, on the other hand, might be something like warm-bloodedness in humans. All men are warm-blooded by nature, even murderers, by what people might say. So we have accidental characteristics that vary from one to another, and we have essential characteristics that are going to be universal throughout a category. The fallacy of accident is taking a general but accidental trait of a class of things and assuming that all members in the class possess the same trait, or simply treating an accidental trait as essential. That's the mistake. So if we're going to schematize it, we can say we've got a general rule. It might not be absolutely universal, but a general rule misapplied in a specific case. We've got a specific case where the general rule doesn't apply, and we apply it anyways. So let's take a look at some examples of this. Bill could not have died from the bee sting because every other time he was stung, he only had a mild reaction. Airplane pilots are usually males, so I'm certain that our pilot for this flight will be male as well. Seniors are usually smarter than freshmen, so this senior will be smarter than that freshman. It should be illegal to cut people with knives, so surgery should be illegal as well. Or, lying is universally wrong, according to Kant, so Germans who lied about hiding Jews during the Holocaust did the wrong thing. The next fallacy, we'll call this one the hasty generalization or converse accident. Now, hasty generalization is a formation of a general rule without proper or sufficient evidence. Induction, remember, is a process of moving from particular instances to universal conclusions. And like we said, this could be problematic. We'll discuss that down the road. But at this point, you should simply recall, minimally, that it does not result in certainty. Depending on your philosophical perspective, induction is not itself a fallacy. Most people accept as likely conclusions that are based on induction when there's a sufficiently large body of data to support the generalization. The fallacy, however, occurs when you draw a conclusion from too small a sample, when the whole may result in a very different conclusion. The generalization is constructed too quickly because it is based on a small sample. So that's where the problem occurs. We don't have enough data, or we're doing this too hastily, hence hasty generalization. Now, converse accident is another name for it because it actually runs in the opposite direction of the fallacy of accident, which we just looked at. So contrasting the two, we could do it this way. Accident, or sweeping generalization, is when something is true of the many and is assumed to be true of the few, where converse accident, or hasty generalization, is when something is true of a few and we assume it's true of the many. They're very easy to confuse, but they are very much the opposite. Now, let me show you a quick video clip to illustrate this using my favorite superhero.
Holy Heidelberg, what'd you do that for?
I'm afraid we've been drugged, Robin.
I guess you could never trust a woman.
You made a hasty generalization, Robin. It's a bad habit to get into.
And of course, it doesn't take the world's greatest detective to catch the mistake. But if we're going to schematize it, we say here we have a specific case which is not representative of the whole, yet we're still going to generalize from that specific case to come up with a general rule. Some examples. Let's take a look at a few. Every squirrel I've ever seen has gray fur, so I assume all squirrels must be gray. That person from Charlotte was rude, so I guess people from the South are rude. All Muslims must be terrorists. That computer I bought from Best Buy broke the day I bought it, so Best Buy only sells bad products. Or that CPCC student didn't reason like a real student, so I guess real students don't go to CPCC. Our next fallacy is cliche reasoning, which uses popular or overused phrases in place of relevant evidence. Basically what you might call conventional wisdom. Now, some cliches are appropriate in certain instances, but they're normally examples of overgeneralization if you think about it for a second. Let's take a look at some examples of this, and I think you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about. You ought to go on the trip because nothing ventured, nothing gained. Now, you could counter this advice with an even more famous bit of wisdom. You ought to stay home because better safe than sorry. I mean, how are you going to judge what you ought to do? Well, both of them are based on a cliche. Neither one of them gives you a real good reason to do what you say you ought to do. You can't trust that account of the Punic Wars because history is written by the victor. Now, before moving on to the next couple fallacies, we're going to look at another subcategory. This is the category of reduction. And that happens to be making a complex issue or situation look more simple than it actually is. And this is done by focusing on only a limited aspect of it. So the first fallacy in this category we'll call a faulty analogy. It could also be called a weak analogy or simply a false analogy. A faulty analogy results from an improper comparison. It concentrates on similarities that are accidental while ignoring differences that are essential. So it emphasizes superficial similarities and ignores what we might call substantial differences. The fallacy occurs when you compare two or more things that are not comparable in the area that's relevant to the issue at hand. The purpose of an analogy is to compare things that are similar on relevant points. And an analogy becomes false if it breaks down at the relevant points. So it's worth noting that all analogies, by the way, will break down eventually, because if two things were identical on every point, then what would they be? They'd be completely identical. In other words, they'd be the same thing. So that's one of the drawbacks of analogies. They can only get you so far. Let's take a look at some examples of the faulty analogy. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and since olive oil is also a liquid, it must boil at the same temperature. So this is a great example to illustrate the fact that we're looking at a superficial similarity, both of them being in a liquid state, and ignoring that substantial difference that we're talking about two very different chemical compositions. Since dogs and turtles are both animals, they both must live to be about the same age. Or jumping out of a plane is no different than walking off the edge of a sidewalk. Of course, it's obvious that the speed of impact would be a very big difference between the two. The fact that you're risking your life more doing one than the other, with the exception of maybe stepping off the sidewalk into an oncoming bus. I'd say stepping off the sidewalk is generally a little bit safer. The next fallacy is called this is that, or all answers or no answers. And that assumes that your position is false if you can't answer all the questions that surround a particular issue. It's an attempt to corner an opponent by forcing him to answer questions that are loosely related to an issue. And it definitely has persuasive effect, right? The tactic's designed to make an opponent look foolish if they can't answer certain questions, so that the audience is basically going to reject all of their positions. You could say this has what we call a built-in emotional appeal, so it could also fit with some of the stuff we did way back when we did relevancy fallacies, appeals to emotion. Let's look at a few examples of this one as well. The first one, if you can't explain what the locusts with human heads represent in Revelation 9, then your interpretation of the entire book is false. If you can't tell me what will happen to the insurance industry over the next 10 years, then the Medical Reform Act is a bad plan. It's impossible for us to know everything about an infinite being, so I'm agnostic. The implication here is that since we can't know everything about such a being, then we can't know anything about such a being, which doesn't follow. If you can't explain to me what the purpose of mosquitoes is, or the purpose of that individual rock, or why the universe is so big, then I won't believe that there's a purpose inherent in the universe itself. And then we've got the post hoc fallacy, or the fallacy of false cause. Post hoc fallacy is also known as false or questionable cause. It's short for the Latin post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. The fallacy is identifying something as a cause that's not a cause. That's why it's called false cause. And specifically in this case, reducing the causal relationship to a temporal relationship, right? A relationship with respect to time or chronology. The argument assumes that just because event B follows event A, that A must have caused B. Just remember, chronology is never equivalent to causality. As a matter of fact, identifying causes can be kind of tricky. And we're going to study other causal fallacies a little bit later in this course, but for now I want to note 4 things. Number 1, something might be a partial cause of an effect. There's what we might call an oversimplified cause fallacy, which assumes that A is the sole cause of B when B might have had a complex cause of multiple factors. Number 2, it's incredibly important to be cognizant of distinctions between two conditions that people often confuse, what we call a necessary and a sufficient condition. So, a sufficient condition is when a present condition is adequate to produce an effect, whereas a necessary condition is one the presence of which is required to set up the effect, but its presence alone isn't enough to produce it. So, for example, it's necessary, let's say, for the temperature to be at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or below for it to snow. But just because it is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't mean that it will snow. It has to be 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the atmosphere has to have enough precipitation for the condition to be sufficient to produce snow, and there are various other things to consider. So it's a necessary condition, but it would not be a sufficient condition. Number 3, it's possible to confuse cause and effect themselves. So, for example, the power goes off and the appliance shuts down. Did the appliance shut down because the power went off, or was there a short in the appliance that might have blown a fuse that caused the power to go out in general? Not all cause-effect relationships have a clear chronological order. As a matter of fact, cause and effect properly understood can be considered simultaneous. And number 4, it's possible to assume a correlation or side effect is the cause of another effect simply because they occur together or simultaneously, like increases in ice cream sales with the opening of a public beach. That particular version is often called the cum hoc ergo propter hoc, or the with this, therefore because of this fallacy. Let's take a look at some examples, starting with a video clip from, again, one of my favorite sitcoms.
The Arctic expedition was a remarkable success. I'm all but certain there's a Nobel Prize in my future. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm entirely certain. No, Mother, I could not feel your church group praying for my safety. The fact that I'm home safe does not prove that it worked. That logic is post hoc ergo propter hoc. No, I'm not sassing you in Eskimo talk.
Okay, let's take a look at a few other examples. As usual, I think I've got a few of these. We hit the lottery because I played by lucky numbers. Since the Industrial Revolution, global temperatures have increased, so it's clear that industrial emissions produce global warming. The number of pirates has been decreasing in accordance with the rising global temperature, therefore we need to increase the number of pirates to reverse global warming. John sneezed right after the phone rang, so he must be allergic to ringtones. Becky lost 10 pounds after she started college, so higher education causes people to lose weight. Guns kill people, so if we get rid of guns, fewer people will be dead. Violent teenagers play violent video games, so those games may be what are causing them to become violent. Every time it rains, I see people with umbrellas. If we get rid of all umbrellas, then maybe it would never rain. This is also an example of confusing the cause, rain, with the effect, people carrying the umbrella. The economy went bad after the Bush tax cuts, therefore, tax cuts caused the economic recession. And finally, the number of drownings goes up every time the number of ice cream sales goes up. Therefore, ice cream causes drowning. So here's another very similar example of confusing correlation with causation. The common condition, you could figure, might be something like warm weather, which results in more swimming as well as more ice cream sales at the same time. And that wraps up the fallacies that we're going to take care of in this session. And this brings us to our final session. So next time, part 5, presumption in inductive reasoning, we're going to be looking at the category of missing evidence. All right, so you have now 6 more fallacies added to our growing list of fallacies. 1 session left to go. I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully you got something out of this session, and I know you're going to get something out of the next one. Until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Hundreds of fallacies, and I know you've been pushing forward. And welcome back to critical thinking. I don't like that. Oh my God. Probably more than I can, outline in a moving further forward. Holy mother! You guys are probably getting tired. No, you're not getting tired. This is fun stuff.